The laughter started the moment he pulled through the gates. At the largest luxury car auction Chicago had ever hosted, a single father arrived towing a scorched, mangled Bugatti that barely held its shape. A young CEO in a designer gown told the crowd it was worth less than the fabric on her back. The man said nothing. He opened a dented metal box, produced 3 photographs and a small burned fragment of alloy. 10 minutes later, every person in that room fell silent when a Bugatti specialist confirmed the car had been missing from recorded history for 30 years. What would you do if the whole world laughed at the one thing that could change your life forever? The Chicago Luxury Motor Hall had been transformed that morning into something closer to a cathedral of chrome and money. Valets in black uniforms guided Ferraris and Aston Martins into reserved lanes while guests arrived in tinted SUVs and private town cars, many of them people whose names appeared on buildings rather than in ordinary conversation. The event was styled after the Great Monterey Car Auctions of California, a day when wealth and automotive history were meant to intersect under a single roof, and the crowd that filled the marble-floored lobby was exactly the kind assembled by old money and new ambition in equal parts. Security stood at every entrance. Press credentials were checked twice. The mood was the specific kind of confident that comes from rooms where no one present has ever been told no. Charlotte Whitmore arrived 40 minutes before the first lot was called, and the room adjusted itself around her the way rooms tend to do when someone is both young and formidable. She was 29 years old and the chief executive of Whitmore Automotive Capital, a firm she had built from a single inherited stake into one of the most aggressive forces in the rare car investment market. Her reputation was precise and hard-edged. She had never lost a deal she chose to pursue, and she had a particular talent for identifying value that others missed. She wore slate gray, her hair pulled back, her expression the studied composure of someone who had long ago decided that warmth was a liability in rooms like this. People approached her carefully, the way one approaches a successful predator at rest. It was the sound of the crowd shifting that drew her attention first, then the laughter, a low, incredulous sound that started near the side entrance and spread without effort. Wyatt Bennett had arrived, and he had arrived in the only way he could afford to, in a dented pickup truck pulling a flatbed trailer that had seen better decades. Sitting on that trailer, strapped down with cargo belts that had been knotted and re-knotted until they held, was what appeared at first glance to be a car that had been found at the bottom of a river after spending several years in a fire. The body panels were warped and blackened. The windshield was gone entirely. The wheels were misshapen, the rear quarter panels collapsed inward, the engine cover fused shut by heat. The frame, visible in 3 places where the bodywork had burned away completely, showed deep oxidation along every exposed seam. Security intercepted Wyatt at the service gate, and the exchange was brief and not particularly kind. One guard told him plainly that the scrapyard was not on the premises. Another suggested he check the address on whatever piece of paper he was holding. Wyatt did not argue. He produced a printed confirmation and waited while it was reviewed, his hands resting at his sides, his face holding the particular stillness of someone who has been underestimated so many times that the experience has become unremarkable. In the cab of the truck, his 7-year-old daughter Bonnie sat with a dented metal box on her lap, watching the security guards through the windshield with large, attentive eyes. When the gates finally opened and the truck rolled through, the laughter that followed was open and unrestrained. Charlotte watched from near the registration tables, and the remark she made to the woman beside her traveled further than she intended, that the car was not worth the fabric of the dress she was wearing, and it drew more laughter, and she did not retract it. Wyatt parked, stepped down from the cab, lifted Bonnie to the ground, and took the metal box from her hands. He looked at the crowd for a long moment, then looked back at the ruined car with the expression of a man reading something no one else in the room could see. When someone near him asked, loudly enough to perform the question for the crowd, whether he had driven that thing off a cliff, Wyatt turned and said, in a voice quiet enough that people had to stop laughing to hear it, that they did not know what they were looking at. The garage where Wyatt Bennett made his living sat at the end of a cracked concrete driveway in a suburb southwest of the city, a squat 2-bay structure attached to a house that had been old when he moved in and had not improved since. The neighborhood was the kind that had once been solidly working class and was now something harder to name, a place where small lawns were kept up out of pride and cars were repaired in driveways on weekends, where noise ordinances were respected because everyone needed sleep. It was not a neighborhood that appeared in any publication that covered automotive events, and no one who attended those events had ever driven through it. He had established a modest reputation in the region for his work on European imports, particularly cars from the 1960s through the 1980s, machines that required a knowledge of proprietary fastener systems and discontinued hydraulic components that most shops in the area did not have and did not want. He charged fair rates and took his time and did not pretend to know things he did not know. His regulars were owners of aging Citroëns and early Alphas and the occasional British Roadster, whose original electrical systems required both skill and patience, and they trusted him because he had never once recommended a repair that was not necessary. He did not get rich from this work. Bonnie moved through the garage the way children move through places that have become familiar and beloved, which is to say she moved through it as though she owned it without needing to be told. She kept her own small workspace on a low shelf, a single broken-down model car she was reassembling from components she had cataloged in a notebook she carried everywhere, a set of small screwdrivers her father had given her for her 5th birthday, and a corner of a shop rag dedicated to nothing else. She asked questions constantly, and her father answered them all, and on evenings when he worked late she sat on an overturned oil drum near the compressor and read or drew or watched him, comfortable in the noise. On those evenings, after dinner from the pizza place 2 blocks over, Wyatt would unlock the heavy padlock on the second bay and stand for a moment in front of the covered shape at the back of the space. He never uncovered it with Bonnie in the room. He would check the locks, check the tarp, and relock the bay before coming back inside. The wall of the main garage held things he did not hide, a series of photographs from race events in Europe, some going back 40 years, a large-format technical drawing in faded ink bearing the distinctive horseshoe emblem of a French manufacturer, and several pages of handwritten notes in French that had been laminated and pinned carefully above his workbench. Bonnie had asked, once, whether the car in the locked bay was as special as he treated it. He had set down his wrench, looked at the locked door for a long moment, and told her it was the last thing her mother had left behind. She had not asked again. Across the street that night, a dark sedan sat with its engine off and its driver watching the garage through a long lens. Charlotte Whitmore did not typically pursue what she could not categorize. Her firm's methodology was built on documentation, provenance chains, and verifiable auction histories, and everything she acquired passed through a rigorous process before her signature went on anything. The system had made her successful, and she trusted it absolutely. But the car in Wyatt Bennett's second bay had no auction history, no current documentation, and barely any visible surface left, and she could not stop thinking about it. She told herself it was a professional reflex, the habit of recognizing when something did not add up. She had watched Wyatt's face in those first minutes at the motor hall, the way he had not reacted to the laughter in the way a man running a stunt would have, the way he had looked at the burned car with something she recognized as grief rather than performance. She had dealt with enough people in this business to know the difference between someone selling a story and someone living inside one. She made inquiries before the week was out. The offer she brought to his garage on a Thursday afternoon was $50,000. She presented it as a courtesy, more than the vehicle could reasonably be argued to be worth in its current state, reasonable under any standard, generous by most. Wyatt listened to the number, nodded once as though confirming something he had already known, and told her no. The refusal was immediate enough that she briefly wondered whether she had misspoken. She had not. He was simply not interested. She asked whether he had a number in mind. He said the car was not for sale. She stood in his driveway for a long moment trying to find the angle, the specific form of leverage or persuasion that would move the situation, and found nothing. Adrian Keller reached her the following morning. He was a Chicago institution in the collector car world. A gray-haired, soft-spoken fixture at every major auction who had spent 4 decades building a reputation as someone who knew where bodies were buried, literally and figuratively, in the automotive history market. His advice was simple and offered without explanation: leave the car alone. When she pressed him for a reason, he deflected with something vague about disputed background and the complications of unverifiable provenance. She recognized the evasion but did not yet know what it was concealing. She hired a private researcher instead. What came back over the following week was fragmentary and strange. Wyatt Bennett had worked, between the ages of 22 and 26, for a small but respected European restoration firm that contracted with several major manufacturers on historical preservation projects. His technical records from that period were largely absent, not sparse or poorly filed, but removed, the kind of systematic erasure that required intent. One photograph had survived the process, tucked in a magazine archive that apparently no one had bothered to digitize. It showed a pristine, unmistakably rare French prototype in a testing compound, flanked by two men. One was a heavy-set engineer whose name appeared on 3 patents filed in the early 1990s. The other was younger, lean, standing with the particular ease of someone who had just solved something complicated. He was in his mid-20s. He was Wyatt Bennett. Charlotte printed the photograph and set it on her desk and looked at it for a long time. What Charlotte Whitmore had stumbled into the edges of was not, at its center, a story about a car. It was a story about a decision made by a group of people with significant resources and limited ethics, made almost a decade earlier in a converted factory in the south of France, where a small team of engineers and materials researchers had spent 3 years working on something that was never supposed to exist publicly. The project had begun as a collaboration between an independent French automotive engineering group and a major manufacturer seeking to test the structural limits of a new composite alloy under conditions that a standard commercial vehicle could not survive. The alloy itself was the point. It had been developed by a researcher at a university materials science department in Lyon, a woman named Elise, who had spent 7 years isolating a specific bonding behavior in titanium ceramic composites under high thermal load and had concluded, after testing, that the material behaved in ways that had applications far beyond automotive engineering. The car was the container for the test, not the product. It was built once, in a single unit, specifically to push the alloy beyond any conditions that laboratory testing could replicate, and it was given a chassis number that did not appear in any public production record. Wyatt had been brought onto the project in his mid-20s, hired for his skills with European drivetrain systems and his ability to work quietly without needing to understand the full picture. He had been told it was a proprietary speed trial. He had believed that for approximately 18 months. What changed his understanding was the arrival of Elise, who had been invited to observe a late-stage test and who stayed, and who over the following months became first his colleague, then his closest friend, and eventually his wife. Elise had shown him the full scope of what the alloy could do. She had also shown him what she found when she began asking questions about who owned the intellectual rights to her research. The answers were not the ones the contracts suggested they should be. A separate company, incorporated in 3 jurisdictions with overlapping ownership structures, had been systematically acquiring the rights to her work through a series of agreements that she had signed without understanding their cumulative effect. The alloy, if it performed as she believed it would, had uses in aerospace and defense manufacture that made its commercial value vastly larger than anything in the automotive world. Someone had known this before she did. The project ended in a fire. The official record described it as an electrical fault in the compound's testing bay. The car, which had been inside, was listed as destroyed. 2 months later, a structural investigation was quietly closed. Elise had been demanding formal answers about the ownership agreements in the weeks before the fire and had received none. 8 months after the incident, she died in a road accident on a stretch of highway outside Lyon that she had driven 300 times without incident. Wyatt had not believed in the accident from the first moment he was told about it, and he had spent the years since in the specific paralysis of someone who knows something can never be proven to the standard that changes anything. He had brought the car back to the United States without telling anyone. It had not been destroyed in the fire. He had moved it 3 times before settling in Chicago, and he had a mailing address, a low profile, and a garage that no one important had ever cared about until a week ago. Charlotte read the summary her researcher had assembled, set it down, and understood for the first time that she had made a very large mistake. Word traveled in the collector community the way it always does, which is to say faster than anyone intends and with details that shift slightly with each retelling. The story that began as a rumor on a private forum that a burned, unverified Bugatti prototype had surfaced in Chicago with a chain of custody going back to a European test program became, within 10 days, the dominant conversation in every room where serious money met serious metal. A figure from a Dubai consortium made a call to a Chicago attorney to determine whether there was a legal mechanism for compelling a sale. A Japanese collector who had spent 30 years assembling one of the most complete collections of European prototype vehicles sent his representative on the next available flight. A European Automotive Heritage Foundation issued a carefully worded statement expressing interest in any documentation related to lost prototype vehicles from the relevant period. A private equity fund focused on alternative assets opened a file. The garage on the southwest side of Chicago became, in the span of a week, a subject of intense interest to people who had not known it existed 7 days earlier. A black SUV appeared on the street one afternoon and did not move for 6 hours. A man in a gray jacket who introduced himself as a journalist asked a neighbor questions that had nothing to do with journalism. Wyatt noticed all of it. He had been expecting something like this since the day he pulled into the motor hall. Bonnie noticed it too, and that was the part that kept Wyatt awake at night. She had begun cataloging the vehicles that reappeared on their street, writing down partial plate numbers in the same notebook she used for her model car project, and she had started sleeping with the bedroom door open so she could hear the garage. She asked her father, one evening over the sink while they were washing up, whether the people in the car across the street were going to try to take the Bugatti. He told her that some people would try to take anything they wanted if they thought no one was strong enough to hold on to it. She considered this, dried her hands, and went to check the padlock on the second bay herself. The night the garage was first tested, Wyatt was asleep when the motion sensor triggered. The intruder had done adequate preparation. The security camera on the east wall was covered before the side door was approached, but had not anticipated the second camera or the proximity alarm on the interior door. Wyatt was in the bay within 45 seconds, and the figure at the door had gone before he could see a face. Nothing was taken. The padlock held. He filed no police report. He called no one. The morning after, a formal written offer arrived by courier. $8 million in certified funds. No conditions attached. Settlement within 48 hours. The letterhead was a holding company he did not recognize. He folded the letter, put it in the same drawer where he kept Bonnie's old artwork, and went back to the carburetor he had been rebuilding for a customer since Tuesday. He told Bonnie that evening, while she was arranging her model car components by size, that the most dangerous thing in the world was not poverty or powerlessness but simple greed, because greed was the one appetite that convinced people they were entitled to what belonged to someone else. She listened carefully, nodded once, and asked whether they should get a bigger padlock. He said yes. Charlotte Whitmore came back to the garage on a Sunday, without an appointment and without a number in her head. She told herself she was following up on a business matter. She knew, by the time she reached the driveway, that this was not entirely true. The main bay was open, and inside it was the specific cluttered warmth of a working shop, the smell of penetrating oil and clean rags, the radio playing something low, a domestic fluorescent hum from the bench lights. Wyatt was in the far corner with a welding mask pushed up on his forehead, rerunning a section of frame rail on an old German sedan whose owner had deferred maintenance into structural compromise. Bonnie was at her shelf, fitting a tiny engine block into the chassis of her model with a precision that belonged in a machine shop and not in the hands of a 7-year-old. Neither of them heard Charlotte pull in. She stood in the bay entrance for a moment, watching. The garage was cold in the way of buildings that rely entirely on the heat generated inside them, and it was small and the equipment was old, and there was no particular elegance to any of it. But there was something she found unexpectedly difficult to walk away from, some quality in the arrangement of the two figures in the space, the father and daughter working in their separate quiet with the ease of people for whom this was the center of the world rather than the margin. She had spent her professional life in rooms where everything was positioned to imply abundance. She could not immediately name what this room implied. Bonnie saw her first and said hello without apparent surprise, as though visitors appearing in the doorway were an ordinary feature of Sunday afternoons. Wyatt set the welding torch down, wiped his hands, and waited. Charlotte had prepared something to say and found, standing in the actual garage rather than in the imagined version of it where she had rehearsed, that it no longer applied. She asked him directly why he would not sell, without attaching a number to the question this time, the way someone asks a question they actually want answered rather than one designed to open a negotiation. He looked at her for a long moment with the evaluating patience of a man deciding whether a person was worth the truth. And then he told her. He said that when the car was sold, The record it carried, the physical evidence of a project deliberately erased, of work that had been stolen, of a person removed from the history that her own research had helped create, would transfer to a buyer whose interest in any of that was exactly zero. He said that Bonnie would grow up in a world where her mother had never existed in any official document. He said he was not willing to accept that in exchange for $8 million or $80 million. Charlotte stood in the garage bay for a long time after he finished. She thought about the 15 deals she had closed in the past 2 years, the specific arithmetic of each one, the pride she had taken in the precision of her assessments. She thought about the way she had stood in the motor hall and said what she said and let the room laugh with her. The weight of that, specifically, was not a sensation she was accustomed to. Adrian Keller had been in the collector car world for long enough that he had become part of its architecture, the kind of person whose presence at any significant event was simply assumed. He had handled the estate sales of 3 major American collections and had served on the advisory boards of 2 European automotive foundations, and he had spent that entire time carefully managing what he knew about a project in the south of France that had technically never existed. He had been involved tangentially at first, introduced through a mutual contact at a Swiss investment firm, and had been asked to consult on the eventual commercial management of any vehicles the project produced. He had understood, from the first meeting, that the project involved information about both the car and the alloy that would need to be contained. He had told himself, in the way that people tell themselves things that allow them to continue, that his role was administrative rather than consequential. He had been wrong about that for 9 years. The problem was not the car itself. The problem was the documentation. The alloy research, if formally authenticated, carried implications for 2 defense contractors whose current valuations depended on holding exclusive access to composite material technology that Elise's work had predated by 4 years. The patents involved were worth, conservatively, somewhere between $300 million and $1 billion, depending on the defense contracts attached to them. The car was almost incidental. It was the evidence the car carried that made everyone nervous. Adrian engaged a man he had used before on similar discrete matters, someone with a professional background that allowed him to approach problems without the limitations that applied to ordinary contractors. The instructions were specific: retrieve the metal box, retrieve any laminated documents, and leave the car itself untouched to preserve deniability. The man he sent had done this kind of work a dozen times and had never had a complication. The complication this time was Bonnie. She had woken at 2 in the morning to get water and passed the garage window in time to see a figure moving through the unlocked front bay. She did not scream. She found her father's phone and dialed the neighbor 2 doors down, a retired machinist named Dale who had Wyatt's spare key, and she told him what she saw in a voice that was careful and clear in the way that children's voices sometimes become in the middle of genuinely frightening situations. Wyatt was back inside from the street in under a minute. The man Adrian had sent got out before Wyatt could identify him, but he did not get the box. What he got instead was a bruised shoulder from the doorframe and the bad luck of having left a partial print on the interior alarm panel that a friend of Wyatt's, a former law enforcement technician, was able to lift and run informally 3 days later. The print did not connect to Adrian directly, but it connected to enough. What Wyatt did with this information was not what Adrian expected. He did not go to the press, and he did not go to law enforcement, where he knew the story would be complicated by its age and by the corporate resources that could be deployed against it. He called Charlotte Whitmore, not because he trusted her but because she was the only person in the collector world with both the standing and the current motivation to be a credible public advocate for what the car actually was. He told her what he needed, which was not money or legal protection but visibility. He needed the car authenticated in a setting too public to suppress. Charlotte listened to every word. Then she made 6 calls. By the end of that evening, she had arranged for a formal authentication event to be held at the Motor Hall within 3 weeks, had secured the commitment of a French Automotive Heritage Institute to send its chief technical examiner, and had notified 3 separate wire services that something significant was going to happen in Chicago. Adrian learned about the event from a colleague the following morning. He made several calls that went poorly. Then he made plans to attend. The Chicago Luxury Motor Hall looked different the second time Wyatt Bennett drove through its gates. Though the difference was not in the building. The change was in what the room contained: 6 cameras from 3 networks, 4 automotive journalists whose bylines appeared in publications that operated at the intersection of cultural authority and significant money, the chief technical examiner of the Institut du Patrimoine Automobile from Paris, 2 independent metallurgical analysts carrying equipment in brushed aluminum cases, and approximately 300 people who had, each in their own way, been arguing about this car for 3 weeks. Bonnie sat with Charlotte near the front, wearing her good coat and holding the metal box. The examiner was a man named Philippe, 61 years old, who had spent the last 32 years of his career documenting, authenticating, and occasionally debunking claims related to French automotive heritage. He had authenticated 18 vehicles previously, refused authentication on 43, and been challenged on his conclusions precisely 0 times by anyone whose challenge had succeeded. He did not rush. He did not perform. He moved around the car with the deliberate economy of someone for whom looking carefully had long ago become more useful than speaking quickly. Adrian Keller stood near the back of the room with 2 attorneys. His presence carried the quality of a man who has arrived early to control a situation and is beginning to understand that the situation has other plans. He had made a submission to the Examiners Institute suggesting procedural irregularities in the authentication request, and the submission had been reviewed and set aside. He had contacted 2 of the journalists present and suggested the car's provenance was actively contested, which was accurate in the way that all incomplete statements are accurate. He was operating in the shrinking space available to someone whose best option is delay. Philippe worked for 4 hours. He documented the visible chassis markings, ran 2 non-destructive spectral analyses on exposed metal sections, reviewed the documentation Wyatt provided, the laminated technical drawings with Elise's marginal annotations, the milled identification plate, the ceramic sleeved alloy sample, and spent 40 minutes in private consultation with the metallurgical analysts. He photographed everything. He asked Wyatt 4 technical questions in French, and Wyatt answered all 4 correctly, and the examiner made a small note on his clipboard. When Philippe addressed the room, he did it in English. His accent was precise and his phrasing was the kind of formal clarity that exists when a person has said important things before and has learned not to surround them with unnecessary material. He stated that the vehicle was consistent in every verifiable aspect with a prototype chassis designated in internal institute records as the only known unit produced under the development contract in question. He stated that the identification plate was original and had not been fabricated or transferred. He stated that the alloy sample matched the compositional specifications of a material that had been the subject of documented research by a named researcher in the early 1990s. He stated that the vehicle had not been destroyed, as the historical record claimed, but had been preserved, and that it was, to the best of his professional assessment and the Institute's supporting analysis, the sole surviving prototype of its kind anywhere in the world. He paused for exactly 3 seconds. Then he said the vehicle's assessed value, for insurance and historical registration purposes, was not less than $20 million. The room was not silent in the way rooms are silent when nothing is happening. It was silent in the way rooms are silent when something irreversible has just occurred, and everyone present is deciding what that means for them personally. Charlotte watched Wyatt's face and saw nothing theatrical in it, no triumph, no performance of vindication. He looked at the car for a long moment with the expression of someone who has been carrying something for a very long time and has just been told he can set it down. Adrian left before the official statement was issued. His attorneys followed. Bonnie crossed the room, stood next to her father, and put her hand in his, and he held it, and neither of them said anything. The board of Whitmore Automotive Capital met in emergency session 36 hours after the authentication. The call Charlotte joined from a hotel room in Chicago lasted 2 hours and 20 minutes, and its tone ranged from formal concern to open hostility depending on which board member was speaking. The criticism was specific and not entirely unfounded. She had used her position and the firm's operational resources to facilitate a public event whose outcome she could not have guaranteed, on behalf of a private individual with no existing relationship with the firm, in a situation that involved credible legal exposure from a contested ownership claim. One director used the word reckless 3 times. Another suggested, with the careful indirection of someone leaving an option on the table, that the firm might benefit from a leadership review. The stock moved the following morning, dropping 4.5% in the first 2 hours of trading, which was not catastrophic but was visible, and visibility was the part that mattered. 3 institutional investors made inquiry calls. The financial press ran brief items noting the unusual circumstances. Charlotte gave no interviews. She stayed in Chicago. What happened next was not something she had anticipated and was not something her firm's communications team had prepared for. The wire photographs from the authentication event had been published before midnight, and the image that spread most quickly was not the car or the examiner or the documentation. It was a photograph taken from the side of the room, showing Charlotte standing between Wyatt and Adrian Keller in the moment before the examiner began his report, her expression closed and focused, her body positioned in the physical space closest to Wyatt's side of the room. Someone with a good eye for composition had framed it precisely as CEO choosing a side. The response was difficult to measure in any category that usually governed the decisions of people in Charlotte's position. It was the specific affection that the public occasionally extends to someone who appears to have done the right thing at visible personal cost. The phrase that attached itself to the coverage, appearing first in a financial commentary piece and then spreading into general use, was simple and accurate enough to stick, the CEO who chose truth over money. Her phone ran out of battery twice. 3 days after the board call, 2 of the 3 directors who had been most critical reversed their positions. The stock recovered and then exceeded its pre-authentication price. Charlotte was not moved by any of this in the way she might once have been. She registered it as information. She recognized that the business case had resolved in her favor and that the resolution had required her to do nothing she would not have done regardless of the outcome. That distinction, doing the right thing and having it also be the correct strategic decision, was one she had never previously experienced because she had never previously arranged her choices in a way that required separating them. She drove back to the southwest side of Chicago alone, without calling ahead. It was not a conversation Wyatt had planned to have, and Charlotte had not come with a plan for having it. She arrived in the early evening, when the streetlights were coming on and the temperature had dropped enough that the garage felt warmer than the street, and Bonnie was already in bed, or close to it, and the locked bay was unlocked, and Wyatt was sitting on an overturned toolbox in the yellow light looking at the car the way a person looks at a letter they have read so many times they no longer need to open it. He told her about Elise the way people tell things they have kept for a long time, not chronologically, not with any particular structure, but following the internal order of things that have been turned over and examined from every angle until the sequence that makes the most sense is simply the one that comes out. He told her about the project, about the alloy, about the moment Elise understood what had been done with her research. He described her in the way people describe the specific intelligence of someone who saw around corners, not the grandeur of it but the ordinary daily experience of it, the way she would solve a problem before it fully formed, the way she annotated everything so that the record would be complete even if she were not there to explain it. The accident had happened on a route she had driven 300 times. The weather was clear. Her car had no prior mechanical issues. The investigation had been initiated, had produced inconclusive findings, and had been closed. Wyatt had been in Chicago by then, having taken the car out of France 6 months earlier on the specific instruction of Elise, who had believed that its physical presence outside Europe was the most effective form of insurance she could arrange. She had not told him this directly until 3 weeks before her death, in a letter that arrived after the accident, timed by a postal delay and postmarked the day she died. The letter contained the ceramic-sleeved alloy sample, the identification plate removed from the chassis before Wyatt brought the car north, and 3 photographs taken by Elise herself during testing. It also contained a single handwritten sentence that he had not read to anyone, had not photographed, had not shared. He told Charlotte that the sentence said that some things need to survive until the world is ready to see them clearly. He had assumed, for years, that the right moment would announce itself with some clarity, a shift in the legal landscape, a change in the corporate structures that had buried the research, some event that made the story safe to surface. It had not come that way. It had come in the form of a burned car and a room full of people laughing at him. He said this without self-pity, as a plain statement of how things had actually gone. Bonnie appeared in the doorway between the bay and the house in her pajamas, carrying the small tarnished key on its original chain that her mother had mailed separately to the neighbor, with a note asking that it be kept for Bonnie until she was old enough to understand what it opened. They had found it together 3 years earlier in a box of things the neighbor had held onto without knowing what they were. The key opened nothing they had ever been able to identify. Wyatt believed it was from the original chassis lock set, removed and sent as proof that the car had existed and been preserved. Bonnie had worn it on a cord under her school clothes ever since. She walked across the garage in her socked feet and stood in front of Charlotte and held out the key. Charlotte looked at it for a moment without taking it. Bonnie said that her mother had told the neighbor, in a note Bonnie had memorized and could recite by heart, that good people always find their way back to the right side of things. Charlotte took the key from Bonnie's hand. She held it for a long time. She did not say anything. The tears came without warning and without particular drama, the kind that come from something landing in a place that has been protected for a long time and is not prepared for impact. Wyatt took Bonnie back to bed. When he returned, Charlotte was still in the same position, in the yellow light of the bay, holding a key that was 40 years old and still retained the machine-cut precision of something made to do exactly one thing. The auction that followed was not like the one where it had started. The venue was the same building, but the room that assembled on that evening had a different quality, more carefully composed, more aware of what it was doing. The event had been organized through a process Charlotte had driven and Wyatt had approved, and its terms had been stated publicly before the first bidder registered. The vehicle was being offered as a restricted transaction, with the precise legal parameters of the sale to be determined by the seller, and any bidder who could not accept that framework was invited not to register. The bidding began at $3 million. This was a formality, and everyone in the room understood it. The real conversation started at $5 million, where 3 active bidders were still present, and moved to $7 million within 8 minutes as a European consortium pushed the Dubai Group and the representative of an American technology investor who had recently pivoted to rare automotive assets. At $9 million, the Dubai consortium dropped. At $11 million, a Japanese collector's representative entered with a single paddle raise that moved the number to 12.5. The American representative countered at 14. The European consortium came back at 16. The Japanese bid arrived again at 17.5. Wyatt sat in the second row with Bonnie beside him. He had not slept in any meaningful way for 3 days, and it did not show on him in the way fatigue usually shows, which is to say as distraction. He was entirely present. He watched the paddle movements with the same attention he gave to engine diagnostics, reading the bidders the way he read machines, noting the hesitation, the resolve, the calculation cycling visibly behind composed auction house expressions. Bonnie watched the number board, tracking each change with the small notebook she had brought, writing the amounts out in words the way her father had taught her. The European consortium came back at 19 million. There was a pause of approximately 20 seconds, which in that room and under those conditions was a geologically significant amount of time. The Japanese representative raised at 20 million even, and the room absorbed this in the way rooms absorb moments that have clearly resolved something, with a collective exhalation and the specific cessation of motion that happens when an outcome has become certain. The auctioneer called the number 3 times. It stood. Then Wyatt raised his hand and asked to address the room. This was not standard practice, and the auctioneer glanced at Charlotte, who nodded. Wyatt stood, and the room gave him the silence it gives things it has decided to pay attention to. He said that he was accepting the bid, and that the terms of the transaction, which had been filed with the auction house in writing before the event, were as follows. The sale conveyed display and exhibition rights to the purchasing institution on a renewable 50-year term and did not convey material ownership, which remained with the Bennett family in perpetuity. The car would not be modified, disassembled for study, or held in private storage. It would be exhibited in a public access facility, and as a condition of the transaction accepted by the purchasing institution in writing 2 days prior, the documentation of the original prototype project, including the full research record of Elisa's alloy work, would be formally submitted to the Institut du Patrimoine Automobile for permanent historical archive, with her name, her credentials, and her authorship of the research restored in full to every record in which they had been replaced or removed. He said this in the same quiet voice he had used in this building once before. The room was silent for the length of time it takes a large group of people to understand what they have just witnessed. Then it was not silent. The standing ovation that began at the back of the room moved forward in the way that genuine responses move, not in waves but all at once, the entire space shifting to its feet in a single motion. Charlotte stood. The examiner stood. Bonnie stood on her chair with the notebook open to the page where she had written $20 million in letters as large as she could make them, and she looked at her father, and he looked at her, and the car, scorched and misshapen and irreplaceable, sat in the light of the room it had finally been allowed to enter. Wyatt opened the new garage in the spring, 3 months after the auction, on a street in the same neighborhood where he had always lived. It was larger than the old one, with a second lift and proper ventilation and a tool wall that did not require workarounds, and it smelled correctly of oil and metal and work. Charlotte had provided the capital through a structure she and Wyatt had taken 2 weeks to negotiate, one that gave her no ownership stake, no operational voice, and no claim on any vehicle that passed through it. She had agreed to these terms without modification and had described the investment to her board as a long-term heritage preservation initiative, which was accurate. Bonnie's workspace occupied the entire corner nearest the window. It had a proper bench, her own small lathe her father had sourced from an estate sale in Wisconsin, and a shelf where her model cars were displayed in the order she had finished them, 17 in a row, with the 18th still in progress. She went to school and came home and came to the garage, and she asked questions and got answers, and she was growing in the specific way of children who understand that knowledge is accumulated rather than delivered. Charlotte came to the garage periodically and did not always have a professional reason. She had changed in ways she had not catalogued, because that is not how genuine change tends to arrive, not as a list of differences but as a shift in the register in which the world is perceived. She was still precise and still formidable and still ran her firm with an exactness that produced results. But she had stopped believing that the measure of a thing was solely what someone was willing to pay for it. The Bugatti sat in a climate-controlled gallery on the ground floor of an international automotive museum, on a low platform surrounded by photographs and documentation and a single panel of explanatory text drafted by Wyatt, reviewed by the Institute, and approved without alteration. The burned alloy sample and the ceramic sleeve it had traveled in were displayed in a case beside the car, labeled with full provenance. Next to them was the photograph from the test compound, Elise and Wyatt, young, standing beside a car that was still whole. Below the photograph was a line of text that Wyatt had written and the museum had agreed to display exactly as written, without modification, as part of the original condition of the sale. It read, "Some things survive fire because truth survives longer than greed." The world had laughed at the burned car once. What it had never seen, standing outside a service gate on a cold Chicago morning and watching the laughter spread, was the thing that could not be scorched or bent or erased or purchased, the specific, unspectacular dignity of a man who had known all along exactly what he was holding.